We're going to focus in on that second word of our statement, is. And that's such an important. And as I start today, I want to first of all, I want to say, I thought of a word I think everybody will be able to relate to, and I wish I had time to go through and get everybody's thoughts on this word, because I think this one word that I want to start off with today, right away, everybody's going to have a different opinion or a different thought on it, and it's going to be interesting how we do this. And the word, just so you know, everybody listen carefully, the word is substitute. Now, when I said that word, a lot of you are involved in school education, and right away you probably thought substitute teacher. Maybe you were a student. Some of you guys were a student a long time ago, so maybe you don't remember it. But substitute teachers, substitutes, that may have been the first thing you came up with. That actually wasn't the first thing I came up with, even though I worked in education for a long time as a principal and teacher. But I get the whole substitute teacher thing. That sort of works. But I was thinking about maybe health. That's where you're at. Maybe you've gone to the doctor and the doctor said, you need to cut sugar out of your diet. So you start using substitute sugars, right? Sweet and low, equal, I can't think of, there's all kinds of weird stuff, maybe with the natural root and you're doing like monk fruit and all other goofball stuff, the substitute in. And so I just cut it out. That's easier for me. Cut it out. Don't do the sugar. I wish. But that's so often a negative thing. Or maybe your doctor said, hey, your cholesterol is bad. Right? And so they said, maybe you ought to cut down on those eggs. And so you went the route of egg substitutes. Yeah, egg substitutes. My mom and dad did that for a while, and I was like, there is no good egg substitute. Eggs are eggs. That's it, okay? And so this is an advertisement for eggs, but that's just how I feel about it. But I just wonder about those. But there's all kinds of substitutes, aren't there? I've been to Africa, I don't know how many times. I've been there so many times, but I remember some of the very first trips. I remember going on a trip to Tanzania, and there are no restaurants in Africa like there are here. There's nothing I can't give you any kind of picture like this is what it was like. But we'd stop at these places that were safe, at least that's what the missionary told us, were safe to eat. And most of those places in Eastern Africa are former colonies of the British Empire, and so they take on a lot of characteristics, especially eating habits of the British. And one of the things you find most common that you'll get as a side item is what we would call French fries. They would call them chips there. But don't think of potato chips. Think of like fried potatoes. And they're pretty greasy. And I remember sitting down, and they'll bring out the condiments, right? And there's only one condiment you're going to bring out with that. It's going to be what they call ketchup. I would never eat ketchup in Africa. I'm just telling you, for a couple reasons. I'm going to give you the two things. But first of all, it looks like plasma. If you've ever been, like you were a poor college student, you went and gave plasma, that's what it looks like in the bottle. It does not look like ketchup. Different color. It's almost got a pink tint to it. It's sort of gross looking. The other problem I have with it is they put it in a water bottle that somebody probably used. And there is no dishwashing facility there, so that would be enough to gross you out. So you don't touch the ketchup there. But I remember sitting down, and the missionary who took us there, and he assured us that the food was safe to eat, which it was. It was very good food. His wife reached into her purse, and she brings out this economy-size Heinz ketchup, because they don't sell that in Africa. You have to import that thing in. And she's like, okay, I'm going to let you guys use my sample just because I'm liking you, but don't get on my bad side. She did that. But everybody knows, just like you guys here in North Carolina, you know there's only one type of mayonnaise, right? Duke's, right, okay. There's only one kind of mayonnaise. Well, there's only one kind of ketchup, and we can have fighting over this one, but Heinz is the only real ketchup there is. Now, there are some okay substitutes that are, but Heinz is the real deal. Heinz is it. Everything else is less than. I think, no, Heinz is garbage. Heinz is the standard. It's the anticipation, right? You guys know the old anticipation is... That's an old school commercial, but anyway, Donnie, you need to sing that one. You know that, the anticipation, right? There you go. He's my singer there. So, I tell you though, when I think about substitutes, as we think about things we substitute sometimes, probably the worst substitute story, and some of you guys, if you're younger than me, you probably won't have a clue about this. You might have heard stories about it, but anybody older, you probably had this happen to you too. But I caught my mom one time when I was a kid growing up, because you realize I'm the baby. I'm the smallest in my family. Okay, yeah, everybody's like, wow. I was the baby in my family. My mom was trying to be frugal, and I caught her one morning because she gets up. My mom always got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and got everything ready for everybody. That's just how she was. And I remember I caught my mom one morning taking an old empty milk jug and pouring this white powder into it, and then going over to the tap and filling it with water and then shaking furiously. And I realized we don't get real milk in our house. We got powdered milk. Ugh. Hey, if you've had powdered milk, you know powdered milk, powdered eggs, two of the worst things they ever came up with on the planet. They're not like the real deal, and they are not good substitutes. And when we talk about this problem of substitutes, now, I just wanted to get everybody thinking on the same page, but here's the real thing I was thinking about as it came to it. I wonder if we have ever replaced God, that is capital G, capital O, capital D, with some unreliable substitute in our life. I mean, that's just the big deal there. In fact, I think when we get down to it, the question I would ask you today is, why is so little of life as satisfying as what we crave? Have you ever considered that? I mean, this is the picture. Why are we fighting so hard for everything? We are going to go and talk about, food. We had a great meal. The guys that came out last night, they know we enjoyed a great meal. There were so many good things to eat and desserts and all kinds of stuff. But you know what? I'm going to have to eat again today. I mean, I ate till I was uncomfortable last night, but I'm going to have to eat again today. Is there any guy that's not going to eat again in the rest of his life that was there last night? Yeah. Why? Because though it was good, it was instead of is satisfying. Did you get what I just said? It was instead of is satisfying. Remember Psalm 73, verse number 25, when Asaph sat back and he said, hey, there's nothing I desire here on this earth besides you, God. What he was saying to us is that everything here on earth is a has been, but it never will be an is. And I know this is sort of a play on words, but you got to think about it. Nothing lasts. In fact, the Bible has a term for this. This guy in about 1,000 years before Christ came on the scene, this guy named Solomon, he sat down and he wrote this letter to, I believe, his son, maybe his younger children, as an old man of what he viewed life all about. In fact, he does a research on happiness, and he uses an interesting Hebrew word. And basically what he tells us is that everything in life is hevel. Now, you're sitting back going, like, that doesn't mean anything to me because I'm not Hebrew. Okay, let me help you out with it. The Hebrew word would really be mist, steam. It has something of little lasting value. In the Old King James, it was used, the word vanity is how they translated it, something that was empty and worthless. In the translation we're going to read today, he uses the word meaningless, and that's what he's talking about. In fact, over in Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 13, Solomon, he decides to dedicate his money, his time, and the wisdom that God gives him, which is supernatural wisdom, to conduct an experiment on human happiness. And he says this, in verse number 13, he says, I applied my mind. Hey, that's always a good start there. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that was done under the heavens. And basically what he's saying is, hey, you know what? I'm in search of what the meaning of life is, what's going to make me happy, and what he comes up with, and this is it. And this is the bottom line, that this is what he finds out. So I'm going to cut the whole book of Ecclesiastes here down for you. This is what he understands. Everything, even the best things in life are hevel. Worthless. They don't last. There was. They're not is, there was. Everything. This is a guy who, he goes through, and if you start reading the book of Ecclesiastes and you follow along what he says, in chapter 2, he says, hey, you know what? I gave myself to find out what was good with women, that is relationships, and when I'm not talking about, there wasn't anything he didn't try. He got involved. You realize this is a guy who had 1,000 women in his life. But he had any woman he wanted, and he did things. Wine, addictions. He tried all of that. He tried work. He built buildings. He talks about it. He says, I built buildings. He tried wisdom. He said, I did things to increase my learning, get smarter. He tried to leave an inheritance for his family. He thought all these things were going to give him something. You know what he comes down to this thought? He says, everything, even the good things, are hevel. They're worthless. They're meaningless. In fact, he sums up, he gives us a thesis statement to start off with. Back up if you're in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse number 2, he says this, meaningless, says the teacher. That's another title he gave himself, the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And if we didn't know Solomon what he's trying to do, we'd be like, what a pessimist. But no, he's a realist. Because what he's found out, or what he's assuming, is what Asaph told us back in Psalm 73, that there is nothing. There's nothing worth it. And yet we still try and make things work, don't we? Because the question we have to answer in our lives is, what are you substituting in your life right now for God? What are you substituting right now for God in your life? Everything in life, according to what Solomon said here in this verse, in verse 2, everything in this life, everything is temporary. It's only briefly present. There is no is. Even some of the deepest things. I had a talk yesterday afternoon with J.W. He came by, and he, once again, pray for him because he's still grieving. He lost his wife this year. And he said, I've lost my mom and dad, and that was hard, but he said, there's nothing like losing my wife. He said, that hurt so bad. And I said, I can't imagine. Actually, I can only imagine. That's it. And I understand what he's saying, but here's what Ecclesiastes would tell us. That even our relationships that are the most prized, our spouse, maybe it's your family, whatever, those are just temporary. And for some of us husbands, that's a good thing because we make problems in our lives. But the truth of the matter is, no joking, that's just temporary. See, we're always going to say was in our relationships, in our food, in our jobs, in our vehicles, in our houses, in our kids, in everything we do, in our entertainment. You do it all the time. Hey, with that trip down to Disney, we didn't say is, that was a good trip. Hey, that mission trip we took to wherever, it's because it's all temporary. Because the reality of life, whether you like to agree with it or not, the reality of life, there is only one is in life, and that is God is. Because he doesn't change. He's eternally existent. And that's the one thing that we should be pursuing, but remember what I said at the beginning? I wonder how often we replace God with an unreliable substitute. We're using that plasma like ketchup instead of Heinz. We're using some off-brand instead of Duke's. We're using powdered milk. Ugh. And that should help us be scared about what our relationship with God. And I realize I'm talking to people that are sitting here in church on a Sunday, and I'm still saying it to them because we do this as Christ followers. How do I know? Could you imagine if we really believed that God is, how packed our churches would be? Oh. See, the presence of God would change everything. It really would be. But I know that the problem is, if you want lasting peace, lasting joy, lasting satisfaction and happiness in this life, it might not be found in the places that you probably would assume they would be. And if you think this is just you're the preacher, so you're bringing this problem up there. Actually, you know what? I had a list, and for time's sake, I chopped the list out. But you know what? Most non-Christians know this to be true. Hey, you all know the words of the song. We've done it before. I can't get no satisfaction. Do you think he was a Christ follower writing that? Nope. Do you realize Tom Brady did a 60-minute interview? Tom Brady, I'm not declaring this, but he's been declared as the greatest of all time. I know some people don't like him. That's fine. I'm just using it as an illustration. But he has won a lot. You can't deny that. Tom Brady sat down in a 60-minute interview, and said, boy, if this is it, it's not very meaningful. This is a guy that has won more than anybody else, but it's not very meaningful. The height of his importance is not very meaningful. And we could go through on and on about music artists who wrote about songs that they said life's not satisfying for them, from big groups like the Rolling Stones all the way down. We could go through famous TV actors, movie actors, the rich and famous or shameless or whatever you want to call them. And every one of these people who don't really pronounce a God in their life would say the same thing, that life not is but was. That there is nothing, the pursuit of money and relationships and all these things did not fulfill them. And that's a problem. Because just like most of us, we miss where we would find the satisfaction in our life. And we have an unreliable substitute. We're using that plasma ketchup, which is really gross. See, here's something that might shock you, but do you realize that everybody on this whole planet, 7+ billion people, do you realize everybody on this planet has the same desire? We do. We all share the same desire. And here it is, to find something really good that really lasts. That's true. Think about it. That's why when you find the bargain of a lifetime, when you find whatever it is that you think you're looking for, you want to right away tell everybody the great deal you got. You post it online like, hey, I bought this car, I got this whatever, I got this grill, I got whatever, and you're telling everybody about the greatest deal, but the problem is it won't last because you'll have to buy another one. You like to tell people about restaurants, but sometimes the restaurants go under because restaurants really aren't very reliable at all. Right? And we talk about all these things, but we don't get any satisfaction because what we're really doing is when we look for all these great things in our life, what we're really looking for is something that is really good that will really last. And that's not going to happen. See, no matter how religious you are or how spiritual you may or may not be, whether you believe in God or not, the hunger and thirst in your soul exists because God, the Creator, put it there. And we all have this desire. In fact, Proverbs chapter 19, verse 22, Solomon, this guy, the wisest man to have ever lived once again, he said this. He said, what a person desires is unfailing love. Isn't that what he's saying? I want something really good that really lasts. That's why it's disappointing when relationships fail. That's what's disappointing when we lose a spouse, a mate. We lose anybody. That's what hurts so bad. Proverbs 19:22, because that's what we all desire. The problem is we keep looking for it in unreliable substitutes. We keep going to the powdered milk for our calcium deposits, and this is gross. It doesn't work. It doesn't last. Augustine, one of the church leaders in the first couple centuries after Jesus, he said this. He said, you have made us with yourself, that is God, you have made us with yourself as our goal, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. And what he's saying is, until you rest in the truth that God is here, the presence of God in your life, your heart will be always restless. And that's what, you look around the world today, do you want to know why there's so much restlessness going on? Substitutes. Substitutes. Fake, unreliable substitutes. Jeremiah, he was a prophet about 600 years before Christ came on the scene, and he is known as the weeping prophet because nothing good happened around him. Be honest with you, he had a job that nobody would have wanted. And he went through the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and saw Nebuchadnezzar come in and tear up Jerusalem. But what really broke his heart is when he looked around and he saw his countrymen, his neighbors, and how they were living. It destroyed him because he realized what they were doing is they were looking for substitutes in their life when they could have had God. And God through Jeremiah says this in Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse number 13. God says this, my people, that is Israel, my people have committed two sins. Here they are. He says, they have forsaken me, the spring of living water. Now, it's interesting the terminology he uses here. They have forsaken me. Obviously, we understand that. But then he says the spring of living water. I remember when I was in high school, we took a couple trips with our school down here to North Carolina in the mountains and spent some time hiking and doing things. And it was so enjoyable, we found some mountain springs. And I don't know if you guys have ever had fresh mountain spring water. It's really good. It is one of the hardships about Florida, I thought, was the water down in Florida is horrible. They put all kinds of nasty in it. My wife knows that. All kinds of nasty stuff in that water down in Florida. It's rough. It'll mess with your stomach and everything else. It takes me a week or two to get settled on that. But that clear, cold mountain stream water, those springs that you ever found one and it just pops up, the water comes and it's cool and clear. And I remember we had bottles with us and we'd fill up as we were walking around because the hot a day, it was just so good. I will say, now there are some springs down in Florida. You go down to Blue Springs National Park, and you go down and see the manatees. It's a warm spring. It's 78 degrees all year round. Now, I think that's a lie that it's a warm spring, because 78 degrees to my 98.7 body feels like freezing cold, okay? But you can go in and swim around unless the manatees are in the springs. But they actually have a place there where you can go in, and they call it the boil, because that's where the water actually shoots up. And they take and do diver certification down there, because when you go way down in there, it gets real dark and all that, and to get the certification, they have to take off the goggles and the breathing apparatus and all that, and then you have to find it and put it back on and get out of there, which would terrify me to death. But that water, it comes up. Now, I don't think I'd drink that water, because there's all kinds of fish and gators and stuff like that in it, which that's just another whole thing. But that water, that warm 78-degree water, it just keeps coming up. And that's the picture that God uses to represent him. As he talks to us and he says, hey, my people, they've committed two sins. And the first one you need to understand is that they've forgotten me. I'm that spring of living water that's popping up. You don't have to bend down and dig for it. You don't have to search for it. It's gushing my grace to you. It's right there in your presence. It's right what I want to give you. But then he says, the rest of it, the second part, he says, and, here it is, and have dug their own cisterns. And if you don't understand cistern, think well. Just think well. We'll use that term. They have dug their own cisterns or wells, broken cisterns or wells that cannot hold water. And so he gives us this picture here of hey, instead of getting what's coming to me, what's flowing up to me, what's clean and cool and clear and what is good, what is refreshing, what is life-saving, what will keep you from being thirsty, and they're ignoring that, and they're getting out their shovels, and they're doing the hard work, and they're digging out their own well, and they think they've got something that's unique, and as they get their own well, it's cracked, it doesn't hold the water, and it mixes in the ground, and it's dirty, it's nasty, and you wouldn't want it. And it really doesn't even hold the water. It doesn't do anything to help. And that's the situation that Jeremiah pronounces here through God of the people of Israel. And what he's given us is a picture of us. Because so often we leave behind God for things that are unreliable substitutes. The plasma ketchups, the non-Duke's mayonnaise. You know what I'm saying? We get the substitute for substitutes, and they're all gross. And we find these God substitutes that we think are going to work for us, whether it's relationships. Yeah, we do that. Put all of our hope in a relationship, a marriage, kids. The problem is they fail because they'll never be is. They're always going to be a was. We work our lives trying to have things. So we have a good truck, good car. We think we got status because we have these things, but you know what? Solomon would tell you, it's coming a day when somebody else is going to have that stuff because it's all temporary. And everything keeps going through these cycles and nothing lasts. And that's what God says. Those are the cisterns you're trying to build. You're trying to fill your life with something that's empty. It's broken. It won't work. The Jewish people that Jeremiah is talking about, you realize too, I want to point this out in case we miss it. These were religious people, right? We're not talking about heathen, ungodly people. These are people who got up every day and prayed prayers. They walked around. In fact, the very clothes they wore had representations of God on them. They wore things tied to their arms that had verses from the Bible on it. And Jeremiah says, hey, you know what? All these things we do, they don't satisfy the solution for the craving of our life. And what they're doing here, he's saying, hey, you know what you're doing? You're looking for some unreliable substitute to solve you. Which brings us really to where we want to be today. 600 years later, after Jeremiah says all that, we find really the story that changes everything. John chapter 4 is where we're at, and it's a very famous story. You probably have heard it. If you've been around church, you've heard it for a while. But Jesus, this guy, comes along. Jesus, the Son of God, he comes along, and he's thirsty one day. And he's gone through an area of town, and he sits down in the middle of the day at noon, hottest part of the day, and he's wanting some food, he's wanting something to drink. He sends his disciples off, and he's sitting there, and down the road walks a very lonely, very thirsty woman. She had been digging at a cistern of her own life, a cistern called romance. She came to that day with a water jug and a deep thirst for something more than water. In John chapter 4 and verse 13, we pick up the story and it says, Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water, speaking to this woman, as she's going to draw water out of this well like she's done every day of her life. He says, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. Will be. You get that? That's a definite there. What he's saying is, your satisfaction from getting a drink out of this water was, but it never will be is. I know these are weird words, but that's just the truth. He says, hey, you know what? You're thirsty every day, and it's going to be something that's going to happen to you every day. And he really wasn't talking about her physical thirst as much as he was her deep need inside of her. He goes on, verse number 14, but he doesn't leave her hanging. He says, I want to help you with your need. He says, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never. Did you get that? That's an is, isn't it? Will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them. Notice what he says here. Doesn't it sound a lot like Jeremiah? Will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. He's talking about satisfaction now. He's not, and by the way, yes, it includes salvation, but it includes so much more than salvation. So if you're sitting back saying, hey, I've already prayed my prayer and I've already accepted Jesus Christ my Savior and I have to listen today. No. Because remember I said there's a lot of Christians that don't find satisfaction because, you know what, there's a lot of Christians that aren't very faithful to God. Because we're still searching for it in our occupations. Still searching for it in our recreations. In the things we have. They make us and they fulfill us and we think that just a little bit more will make it happen. And it won't. And he's telling this to a woman, and what he realizes here is he wants to help this woman with her biggest problem in life. You see, this woman knew how frustrating it was to do the same work every day, because every day she had to come to the same well. Do you get the picture here? Every day she has to bring the same bucket, the same jar, jug, whatever it was. She came the same thing every day, had to put it down that well, and every day she had to use every ounce of her strength to pull that bucket back up. And every day, though she would feel relief after she drank some of that water, every day she got thirsty again. Every day. That's where we're at, isn't it? Every day we want something different. We're looking for a new car, a new job, new relationship, new experience, new recreational point, new minute of fame, fortune, fun. That's what we're looking for. Jesus understood this, and he wanted to help us with this problem. He says down in verse 16, after talking to her, he told her, go call your husband and come back. To which she replies, and this is such an honest thing because Jesus here, What he understood about here in that verse, what he's saying here is, I understand that you're trying to fill the void in your life with that substitute, that unreliable substitute of men. Jesus knew that the men in her past couldn't quench your heart's desire. Listen to what goes on, verses 17 and 18. He says, after he says that, she says, I have no husband, she replied. And Jesus told her, you're right when you say you have no husband. Verse 18, the fact is, you have had 5 husbands. Ouch. You've had 5 husbands, and there's more. And the man you now have is not your husband. What you've just said is quite true. He is applauding her for honesty, and he's helping her with this fact. He's not trying to beat her up, by the way. He's not hitting her over the head going, you bad person for having all these husbands. What he's saying is, you've got a thirst, and you keep going to the well of romance. You keep thinking that if I just get the right man in my life, everything will be okay. And you know, there are people in this room that think that. If I just had the right person in my life would be a whole lot better. Nope. Look at my wife. She's got the right person in her life, and her life hasn't gotten any better. I knew I'd get you smiling that one and nothing. Seriously, we are foolish because we say that. Now, I know I was joking, but the seriousness of it, you know how many young people I've talked to? Actually, parents too. I've talked to people all over the place who think, if I just had the right guy or I had the right girl, and then if that didn't work out, you know what they do? If I just had a baby. If I just had 2 babies, 3. I'm telling you, that doesn't solve. It's crazy, isn't it? And what happens is we end up becoming a nation where the divorce rate is near 50%. You realize that? Amongst Christians. You realize it's higher in Christians than it is in non-Christians? I wonder why. Maybe we're trying an unreliable substitute. Maybe it's powdered milk, plasma ketchup. That's the tough part right now. This woman was wasting her life in worshiping men rather than worshiping the one person who really could help her. This is why, by the way, let me just say this too. This is why Jesus, when he's dealing with this woman, and he acknowledges the fact that, yeah, you've had 5 husbands, and you realize 5 husbands, that means you got a wedding ring for every one of your fingers and one on this hand too. What he's saying here is, I realize this is the problem, and by the way, Jesus says, hey, you know what? I'm going to help you with this problem, but he didn't stop. I noticed this as a preacher. He didn't stop and say, let me give you 10 tips on how to make your marriage work. You know why? She had a broken cistern. Marriage wasn't going to fix her life. Some of us were trying to fix our life with jobs, with finances, with friends, we're filling it with whatever we think education. And there's nothing wrong with any one of these things until it becomes the substitute that is unreliable for the one person we have to have, God. That's the truth. When we fill our lives with trips and fun and all these things, and we forget about capital G, capital O, capital D, God is. Not was. God is. He's the only reliable one. We mess up. Skip down. Jesus, instead of giving her 10 tips on her marriage, he gives her a divine revelation. Verse 26, it says, then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you. So you're very clear on who it is. He says, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. In the Hebrew, that would be I am. I am. And if you don't understand that, you got to go back to Moses in the burning bush when God meets Moses. And Moses says, who are you that I could tell people? And God says, not I was, not I will be, but I am. That's an is. I am. I'm the only thing that's ever going to be all the time constant. And we forget that because we've wasted our lives chasing after things that are going to fail, not succeed. She left, verse 28, look down at this is amazing. Verse 28, she left her jar behind. It says, verse 28, then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town. She left her water pot. Do you know how important that is? That's the symbol in her life of a never-ending pursuit of a thirst she could never conquer. You got that, right? She had a problem that every day of her life she faced, and she finally gets to the point where she meets Jesus, and you know what she does? She sets her jar down next to the well and goes back to town to tell other people about Jesus, not about water, but Jesus. I was wondering, as I studied for this, I was wondering, what would Jesus say to me if I was at that well that day? What would he say to you if you were there at that well that day? What would he tell you need to leave at the well that you keep trying to get to satisfy your life? What's the substitute you keep throwing in your life instead of God? What's the substitute you keep putting there? Well, it's just my hobby. Yeah. Well, what about God? But it's just something I do all the time. Well, what about God? See, this woman sets down the one thing that she thought she had to have to survive. Water, right? Makes sense. Because she realized she had a spring of water inside of her when she had God. See, I think one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to stay happy, why we need another trip, another night out, another pair of shoes, another phone, another gun, another car, another truck, another friend, another relationship. The reason why we need all those things is because God, listen carefully, God never wanted you to be completely content until you found the one that you were created to crave. And that's God. How do I know that? If you're in John 4, flip over to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 is the famous story that's told in every one of the gospel accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus, after that, meets the crowd, and they're hungry still, and they keep asking for more food. And Jesus tells them, and I'm just going to read a couple verses here. Verse 27, this is what Jesus says to the crowd, and this is his answer. He says, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, for on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." You know, food is temporary, even the best food. I'm telling you, you go home and eat some good cooking, and it'll probably be great food, but you're going to need to eat again. That's Jesus making an observation that's so obvious to us that we miss. And what he's saying is, don't keep putting things in your life that really don't satisfy. Why is it we keep craving things other than God? Because we have found ourselves chasing after these unreliable substitutes that you just have to have a little bit more. That's the problem in our life. See, the problem with food is that it doesn't last. That's why Jesus said, look down verse 35. He said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." We're made for more. And that more is not things. It's not other relationships. It's not friends. It's not likes on social media. It's not new songs, new music. It's not any of those things. It's not bigger houses, better incomes. It's not deeper romances or anything like that. We're made for God because God is. And that's why you go back to Psalm 73, verse 25. And a guy named Asaph, who started this journey for us, he told us, "There's nothing I desire on this earth besides you, God." Because in verse 28, he told us it's good to be near God. So what is it today? What is it today that you're pursuing to make you happy? The truth of the matter is, most of us in this room probably are pursuing something that we think is going to fulfill us. A career, a job, friendship. Sometimes it's church. Churchy people like to fill their void with church, programs, Bible studies. And there's nothing wrong with any of these things. But God never called us to be fulfilled with a Bible study. God never called us to be fulfilled with attending church. God said, be fulfilled with me. Me. He didn't say the church is like a spring of water flowing up to you, He never said the pastor. He never said your spouse, your children, your career, your anything. He said, I will be like a spring of water. So what is it today? If you were at that well, what is it today that God, if he was there, Jesus looking right in your eyes, he'd say, why don't you leave that next to the well? What is it? Because the problem we have is we keep putting our hopes and everything on the blessings of life. And this is the bottom line here. The blessing always turns out to be less satisfying than God. And when we take this, the great things in our life, and we make them our God, we've just substituted powdered milk for the real stuff. Plasma ketchup for Heinz. Some off-brand mayonnaise for Duke's. And it's just not the same. God didn't give us the blessings of life for us to put them in our... I know Christians that they get blessed with a new job, and the next thing you know, they're out partying, and they don't have any time to see God, spend any time in his work, spend any time witnessing, spend any time doing anything with God. That's not what God gave you that for. When was the last time you were satisfied with God? Because he's the only one that is.